You pratin, my friend. This is another total philosophy video to read and understand the so frightful Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. We hope you end seeing the beauty of this work as we also see. In this section, Kant moves from a definition to a test. Last time he introduced the idea of a priori knowledge, that is, knowledge that does not come from experience, and now he asks the practical question, how can we reliably recognize it when we see it? His answer is that experience can tell us what happens to be the case, but it cannot justify what must be the case, or what holds with absolute universality. So Kant proposes two diagnostic marks of a priori cognition, necessity and strict universality, claims that admit of no possible exception. From there he begins to show that we already use such cognition constantly, even before doing philosophy, in mathematics, in ordinary reasoning about cause and effect, and even in the basic concepts that structure experience itself, like space and substance. This is the moment where the critique starts to feel like an argument rather than a preface. Kant is not merely introducing terms, he is building the case that the mind contributes essential principles, without which experience would not even be coherent. Shall we start?
Introduction, Part 2. The human intellect, even in an unphilosophical state, is in possession of certain cognitions a priori. The question now is as to a criterion by which we may securely distinguish a pure from an empirical cognition. Experience no doubt teaches us that this or that object is constituted in such and such a manner, but not that it could not possibly exist otherwise. Now, in the first place, if we have a proposition which contains the idea of necessity in its very conception, it is priori. If, moreover, it is not derived from any other proposition, unless from one equally involving the idea of necessity, it is absolutely priori. Secondly, an empirical judgment never exhibits strict and absolute, but only assumed and comparative universality by induction. Therefore, the most we can say is, so far as we have hitherto observed, there is no exception to this or that rule. If, on the other hand, a judgment carries with it strict and absolute universality, that is, admits of no possible exception, it is not derived from experience, but is valid absolutely a priori.
Kant is saying, if we want to prove that some knowledge is a priori, meaning not learned from experience, then we need a reliable test to tell it apart from ordinary experience-based knowledge. His first point is that experience can show you how things happen to be. For example, this metal expands when heated, but experience alone cannot show you that things must be this way and could not possibly be otherwise. So the first test is necessity. If a claim carries a must within it, if it presents itself as necessarily true, then it is a candidate for a priori knowledge. The second test is strict universality. Experience can only justify, as far as we've seen, this always happens, because it is based on observing many cases. But if a judgment claims this admits of no exceptions whatsoever, then it cannot be grounded purely in experience. In short, Kant's criterion is a priori knowledge is marked by necessity and exceptionless universality, whereas empirical knowledge can only give you patterns that hold so far, and usually based on observation.
Empirical universality is, therefore, only an arbitrary extension of validity, from that which may be predicated of a proposition valid in most cases, to that which is asserted of a proposition which holds good in all, as, for example, in the affirmation, all bodies are heavy. When, on the contrary, strict universality characterizes a judgment, it necessarily indicates another peculiar source of knowledge, namely a faculty of cognition a priori. Necessity and strict universality, therefore, are infallible tests for distinguishing pure from empirical knowledge and are inseparably connected with each other. But as in the use of these criteria, the empirical limitation is sometimes more easily detected than the contingency of the judgment, or the unlimited universality which we attach to a judgment is often a more convincing proof than its necessity. It may be advisable to use the criteria separately, each being by itself infallible.
Kant is clarifying why we must not confuse two very different kinds of always. When we generalize from experience, we are basically saying, I've seen many cases and I haven't seen an exception yet, so I'll treat it as a rule. That kind of universality is fragile because a single new case could break it. This is what the 21st century thinker Nassim Taleb coined as the black swan theory. Kant calls this empirical universality, and he says it is really just a bold extension from most cases to all cases. His example is all bodies are heavy. That may look universal, but it still comes from observing bodies and generalizing it. By contrast, strict universality means something stronger. Not no exceptions so far, but no exceptions are even possible. If a judgment has that kind of force, if it claims to hold without exception, Kant says it must come from a different source than experience. It must come from the mind's a priori capacity. That is why he treats necessity, that is, it must be so, and strict universality, that is, no exceptions are possible, as reliable tests for a priori knowledge. Finally, he adds a practical note. In real life, it can be easier to notice one test than the other. Sometimes it's clearer that a claim is not truly universal than it is to analyze whether it's necessary. So he recommends using the two tests separately when judging a claim. Either one by itself can reveal that you are dealing with something a priori rather than something merely learned from experience.
Now that in the sphere of human cognition we have judgments which are necessary and in the strictest sense universal, consequently pure a priori, it will be an easy matter to show. If we desire an example from the sciences, we need only take any proposition in mathematics. If we cast our eyes upon the commonest operations of the understanding, the proposition, every change must have a cause, will amply serve our purpose. In the latter case, indeed, the conception of a cause so plainly involves the conception of a necessity of connection with an effect, and of a strict universality of the law that the very notion of a cause would entirely disappear, were we to derive it, like Hume, from a frequent association of what happens with that which precedes, and the habit thence originating of connecting representations, the necessity inherent in the judgment being therefore merely subjective. Besides, without seeking for such examples of principles existing a priori in cognition, we might easily show that such principles are the indispensable basis of the possibility of experience itself, and consequently prove their existence a priori. For whence could our experience itself acquire certainty if all the rules on which it depends were themselves empirical and consequently fortuitous? No one, therefore, can admit the validity of the use of such rules as first principles. But for the present, we may content ourselves with having established the fact that we do possess and exercise a faculty of pure a priori cognition. And secondly, with having pointed out the proper tests of such cognition, namely universality and necessity.
Kant now says, once you know what to look for, necessity and exceptionless universality, it is not hard to find examples of a priori knowledge in real life. Mathematics is the easiest case. Mathematical truths do not feel like rules we picked up by observing the world. They present themselves as necessarily true, and true in all cases. Then Kant gives a second, more everyday example. The principle, every change must have a cause. The key word is must. Kant thinks the very idea of a cause already includes a necessary connection. If something is truly a cause, it is not just something that happens to come before an event often. It is something that makes the event follow according to a rule. This is where he takes a shot at Hume. Hume suggested that our belief in causality comes from repeated experience, seeing one kind of event regularly followed by another, and then forming a habit of expectation. Kant replies, if causality were only a habit, then we would lose the must and keep only usually, and the concept of cause would collapse into a psychological expectation rather than an objective rule about events. Kant then pushes an even stronger argument. We don't just happen to have a priori principles. We need them for experience to be possible in a stable way. If all the rules guiding our experience were only empirical generalizations, always provisional, always vulnerable to new exceptions, then experience could never have the kind of certainty and coherence we actually rely on. So for the purpose of this introduction, Kant says the takeaway is secured. We do have a capacity for pure priori cognition, and we can recognize it by its two marks, necessity and strict universality.
Not only in judgments, however, but even in conceptions is an a priori origin manifest. For example, if we take away by degrees from our conceptions of a body all that can be referred to mere sensuous experience, color, hardness or softness, weight, even impenetrability, the body will then vanish. But the space which it occupied still remains, and this it is utterly impossible to annihilate in thought. Again, if we take away, in like manner, from our empirical conception of any object, corporeal or incorporeal, all properties which mere experience has taught us to connect with it, still we cannot think away those through which we cogitate it as substance, or adhering to substance, although our conception of substance is more determined than that of an object. Compelled, therefore, by that necessity with which the conception of substance forces itself upon us, we must confess that it has its seat in our faculty of cognition a priori.
Kant is now expanding the point. A priori is not only about statements we make, like every change has a cause, but also about the basic concepts we use to think at all. He asks you to perform a mental experiment. Imagine a physical object, and then strip away everything you know through the senses, its color, its texture, whether it is hard or soft, its weight, even the idea that it pushes back and cannot be passed through. If you remove all those sensory features, the body as a sensory thing disappears. But Kant says something remains. You still think of a space where it was. You cannot fully erase the idea of space from the situation, because space functions like a mental framework in which anything physical must appear. That suggests space is not just learned from experience. It is something your mind brings to experience. He then makes a similar claim about the concept of substance, the idea that there is a thing that has properties. Even if you remove all the particular properties you learned from experience about an object, you still tend to think there must be something underlying them, a subject that carries the attributes, not just a floating bundle of qualities. Kant says we are forced into that way of thinking. It presses itself on us with a kind of necessity. So the concept is not merely copied from experience, it is one of the mind's built-in ways of organizing what we experience. In short, space and substance are examples of concepts whose role in thought points to an a priori origin. They come from the structure of cognition itself, not from sensory observation. What we read here was Kant's attempt to prove, carefully and with clear criteria, that human beings genuinely possess a priori cognition. First, he distinguished empirical generalizations, so far as we've observed, from strict universality, and insisted that only the latter can count as a mark of knowledge independent of experience. Paired with this is necessity, the must that experience alone cannot produce. He then illustrated the point with mathematics and with the everyday principle that every change has a cause, arguing against Hume that causality cannot be reduced to mere habit without losing its essential force of necessity. More importantly, he claimed that some a priori principles are not optional extras, but conditions for experience itself. If the rules that guide experience were only provisional products of experience, experience could never achieve the stability and certainty we actually rely on. Finally, Kant extended the argument from judgments to concepts, suggesting that even when we strip away sensory content, we cannot erase frameworks like space, and we cannot avoid thinking in terms of an underlying substance that bears properties, signs that these are supplied by the mind's own structure. By the end of the section, Kant has secured his interim conclusion. We do have a faculty of pure a priori cognition, and its fingerprints are universality and necessity. This is the end of today's video. In the next video, we will read and understand the third section of the introduction. Philosophy stands in need of a science which shall determine the possibility, principles, and extent of human knowledge a priori. Have a nice day. See you soon.